Okay, apologies to anyone on Zoom. There were a little bit of technical difficulties with the sound, but hopefully it's working now. There is somebody monitoring the Zoom chat, so you can send chat messages, not to me, but to other people who are monitoring it and can deal with it. Okay, so very happy to have the chance to talk with you about my sabbatical experience in Morocco. To all non-academics, the word sabbatical means vacation. In fact, even some academics think that sabbatical means vacation. And as the minority of us that know about it in more detail know, the idea is that we put together a plan to make use of this time. We can use it for research or teaching or a combination. But the idea is to try to grow and stretch and make us better faculty members down the road, recharge our batteries, we return full of enthusiasm and things like that. So that's what I'm hoping for, and certainly feeling already a big pulse of optimism, because this is the first in-person seminar that this seminar series has had in more than a year at this point. So my work took place in the northern part of Morocco, and in speaking to people who haven't had the opportunity to spend time in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and Morocco, in these parts of the world, or look into it for some reason, there's often questions about camels. People ask a lot about camels, and there are camels. This is a scene from northern Morocco. This is on the beach in Tangier, where these camels are waiting for some tourists to come along. But all of the country of Morocco, all of North Africa, this northern region is filled with natural beauty, with tremendous cultural history, with productive landscapes, lots of agriculture, some areas where forests can grow, like you can see in the mountain in the background there, which is part of Talasanthan National Park, the place where I was working. The city in the foreground here is Chefchaouen, and you're looking at the historic Medina of this city. So it gives an idea of some of the cultural richness and beauty. And then when you go up into the mountains, you can find at higher elevations forests with a mixture of species, mesic forests with pine and cedar and fir that are similar to the environments we might see here in the Southwest when we also go up high mountains. And as we're accustomed to here, those mountains are islands, right? In Arizona, we use the term sky island to talk about these cooler, wetter environments at the tops of mountains that are surrounded by much drier or even desert landscapes below. North Africa is similar. These sky islands, both in Arizona and in Morocco, are conserving groups of species that were once more widely distributed back in cooler conditions in previous glacial times, but have now retreated to these places where they can still hang on. And oftentimes they represent areas of high and unique biodiversity that are very important for us to try to conserve, and very challenging given all kinds of threats to these ecosystems, including warming climate. So that's kind of part of the background and part of the connection of these kinds of ecosystems that led me to Morocco. I'm really sorry for the fact that the top of the screen is covered by a bar that I can't seem to get rid of. But this is showing the location of Morocco. It's the northwestern shoulder of Africa. And in the north, you can see where the city of Tetuan is on the Mediterranean, but very close to the Strait of Gibraltar, the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. You can see in the relief map, there are different mountain ranges. There are several ranges of Atlas Mountains. And then in the north is the Rif, R-I-F mountains. The western end and the highest point in those mountains is in Talasanthan Park. The pictures on the right is Tetuan, the Mediterranean coast to the north, looking towards Ceuta. And then the biology department in the University Abdul Malik Asadi, which was my host during the sabbatical stay. It's a very nice facility. That picture looks really deserted. That's how it looked most of the time during the pandemic, because the university's activities were mostly online. And that's part of the price to pay for, you know, engaging in work during a pandemic, but it was a pandemic here as well. So what can you do? now I'm at the point where I don't know what the title says at the top of this. This is the overall project plan. So the overall idea is a conservation and outreach partnership for Moroccan forests, working with the university and the Forest Service. The Forest Service has that long name, the Provincial Management of Water and Forests and the Fight Against Desertification. So that really long name gives you the idea that Moroccans place a lot of value on ecosystem services from forests and are focused on trying to conserve them. And there were these 4 phases that we'll step through. The area is the National Park of Talasanthan. On the sign, you can see the two of the 3 official languages of Morocco, Arabic and French. And the 3rd official language is Amazigh, indigenous language. This is an old sign, or else it would have that on there as well. Here in the higher regions of the national park, we have some species that are endemic to North Africa, like the Moroccan fir. We have species that are endemic to this region, only in North Africa or the very southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, like the Barbary macaque. And other species that are more widespread, like this Corsican peony that's shown the beautiful pink flower. That is a gorgeous component of these mesic forests. So a lot of diversity and a lot of uniqueness held in some very small spaces. The Moroccan fir is only found in this mountain right here in the national park and one other place in the world. So an example of how this endemism is related to biodiversity. The region around the Mediterranean Sea, if you look at the Mediterranean on this map, the word Mediterranean Basin is written right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean there, but it's indicating to the right. It's the inland sea to the right of the word Mediterranean. You can see that the area around the basin is shaded that darker color of gray. And that indicates places that have a Mediterranean climate. The climate graph in the upper right comes from Casablanca, Morocco. Those green bars are moisture. And so in January, February, March, there's a tremendous amount of moisture. And then you see those green bars just take a dive in the middle of the year. So by May, June, July, August, there's no moisture being received at all until it starts to recover in October, November. So this Mediterranean climate of cool, wet winters, not really cold, not below freezing, not a lot of snow, but cool and wet in the wintertime, warm and very dry in the summertime, is characteristic not only of the Mediterranean, but also the other areas shaded gray on this map, like much of California, Chile, South Africa, and parts of Australia. And these regions are of great interest to researchers for a lot of reasons. There are examples of convergent evolution. So adaptations that come from very different organisms, very different groups of plants that are not closely related taxonomically, but that have developed similar adaptations to deal with environments that have extended periods of being very dry, quite hot, and in the case of most of these systems, very prone to fire. So there's a lot of fire-related adaptations and fire studies associated with Mediterranean ecosystems. In the wintertime, this is a end of February, early March picture in Talasanthan, a very wet and chilly environment. But when it dries out, there is the opportunity for hot, dry winds to push fires through dry fuels and produce severe fires like captured in this scene right here, which is kind of a mosaic fire that had patches of high severity and patches of survivors. Currently, we're now in the fire season in Morocco. This news report is from a week and a half ago. And I'm not going to try to show the clip here, but if I did, they show scenes of some of the fire operations and they show some of the fire behavior. And this fire behavior would not, you can see that it's a difficult fire to control. It's moving from one place to another. It's nothing that one could easily go out and stop. It requires firefighters and fire engines and aircraft are used. But compared to what you can see on the news every day from Oregon, from California this summer, from here close to Flagstaff earlier this summer, this fire wouldn't look that bad. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So fires are important, but they're still at a scale of size and severity that is not as severe as we see in the Western United States right now. One reason for that may be some differences in land use activities. This is a really neat study by Brahim Chergi and several other authors, including Julie Pausas, who is a fire ecologist based in Spain, who is giving us a lot of ideas all around the world for thinking about fire, climate, and evolution. And they did a comparison between this northern region of Morocco that I've pointed out to you on the other map and is at the top of this map, and a region of Spain that's roughly the same size, has similar kinds of topographic and climatic patterns. And what they found was that before the 1970s, in the Valencian community with these white bars right here, there was a distribution of fires, more small fires than big fires, and so many in each category per year. After 1975, with these gray bars, you see the number of fires jumps up in each category, and now we're starting to see some fires in the largest category. So we start to see exponential change. That has been observed in the European side of the Mediterranean basin, in Greece, in France, in Spain, in Portugal. The red dots here show the distribution of fires in the northern region of Morocco. The region that was selected with Valencia to be pretty similar in terms of vegetation, the amount of different kinds of fuels. A lot of these fires are not necessarily in forests. They're also in Mediterranean shrublands and grasslands, woodlands and forests. But these two areas are really similar. And the point that they're making is that the contemporary fires in this Moroccan region are more similar to the old days in Spain. Spain has shifted, Morocco has not. Any ideas why that would be? Just wondering if anything strikes anyone.
People moving into interacting with those areas?
Where?
In the forest where the fires have been happening.
The forests that have more fires have fewer people in them?
More people.
They have more people in them. Anybody else? It does have to do, I mean, we don't know the answer, but the speculation does have to do with people.
Less historic suppression.
Okay, that's the story that we have here in the West, right? That we have suppressed fires. We have all these fire crews and airplanes and people coming out of the sky in parachutes and all that because we really have a fixation on suppressing fires. There is fire suppression in both countries, and there has been for a long time. They're not so big on quite that big of an investment. Curious, anybody else? So the title, Socioeconomic Factors, what the authors are thinking, and there's evidence to support this, is that land use is the key difference. That in the old days in Spain and contemporarily in North Africa, there's a lot of intensive use, a lot of rural agriculture, and a lot of that is pastoralism. Grazing of sheep and goats and donkeys and horses, animals that reduce fuels by moving through the landscape and consuming a lot of biomass. And those activities changed in Spain in the mid 20th century because there were opportunities through industrialization, there were opportunities for other kinds of jobs and so forth, a lot of rural abandonment. Those processes happened in Morocco as well, but not to the same extent, so that these kinds of activities continue in northern Morocco. So it's kind of these sorts of factors, none of which we can know for sure. There's no experiment here. We don't have, can't go back in time or anything like that. But we try to draw these connections to try to understand factors so that we can make better decisions about management and conservation. Now, coming back to moving away from their work, coming back to the sites that we worked in, here we're getting into some of the threats to conservation of this national park. I showed you it's a national park. It's got a nice sign, has a website, but those things in and of themselves don't result in effective conservation, right? So this is a patch of forest that was recently cleared and the debris was burned for cultivation. And when you look at this image, you know, if you've engaged in cultivation yourself or thought much about it, I don't know if you would pick this spot on a steep rocky hillside as like, this is where my farm's going to be. Might try to pick something else. But if you're growing a very high value crop and possibly had some reasons geographically for why maybe this is a okay spot for it, then you might pick patches like this and even go up high into a national park and create areas for cultivation. And as it turns out, there is a very high value crop that is being cultivated in the Rif. Cannabis is an interesting and complicated subject in Morocco, and there are some Moroccans that are going to view this presentation and have their own opinions about what I'm saying. So this is definitely, you know, my reading and observations and not trying to completely capture the situation. But my understanding is that there is a historic legacy of cannabis use, traditional uses. But there also has been a period, especially as mentioned here in the quote from this paper, talking about this really modern production, sometimes with very specialized seeds where one individual seed can cost €1. So we're talking about large scale commercial operations, but existing in kind of a quasi-legal, semi-okay situation, which leads to, in some cases, some patches of forest being cleared. The lower picture here is a patch that was cleared, and then the debris was burned here to get rid of it. And you can see how the fire spread up into the trees up above. So one of the things with using fire is, of course, that it can propagate and move across the landscape and go places where you didn't intend for it to go. And so the human-caused fires in the park are a major concern. This is one of the ways in which human-caused fires can spread through here. Other ways include, you know, common reasons like cigarettes, people having a cooking fire, a warming fire, and leaving it unattended, machinery, stuff like that. Typical reasons for fires to occur. In this region, most fires are believed to be of human origin. Lightning obviously does happen, but the climate pattern is very different than what we experience here because it's not so much characterized by these big electric storms with lots of lightning coming in the start of the monsoon, coming in a dry season, like is characteristic of us here in the Southwest. So added to these challenges of land clearing, forest removal, deforestation, and fire, we also have warming climate and the situation where 9 out of 10 of the hottest years are in the last decade. The only one before that is from 2005. So we have this strong warming trend. And then the recently released new report from IPCC suggesting that things continue to go badly at an accelerating pace right now. So that kind of challenge is going to interact with these other challenges, especially the fire challenge, because fire seasons become longer, fuels are drier, ignitions more readily take off and produce more severe fire behavior. So all those kinds of things are connected. So coming back to the overall project here, the first phase involved planning. And I was able to visit the site in 2019. At the top, unfortunately cut off by this very unnecessary bar.
Is it because the two chats are on the right?
Genius, thank you. You'd think Zoom would have thought of that, you know, put a little thing, tell you what to do. It'd be all right if it just cut off my screen, but it's cutting off your screen too. So in 2019, I participated in an Arabic language class in Meknes with Professor Munya Manawar, who was here at NAU. And that was a fascinating experience. My Arabic is terrible, which is not any kind of comment on Munya, who tried with all of us. But we learned an awful lot about Morocco and came to feel more at home in the Moroccan environment. And at that time, I was also able to visit Talasanthan Park and plan and organize things for the sabbatical. So we decided to focus our efforts on looking at fire regimes and their impacts at two different scales, at the full landscape of the park, and then also in more detail at specific stands where we could look at impacts on trees, look at the relationship between forest dynamics, species composition, regeneration, and so forth, and fire events. So this broke out into basically a separate project at each of these scales. At the landscape scale, it became the thesis project for Ileana Castro, who a lot of people here know. She's a recent graduate of the School of Forestry. She was involved with logging sports, worked at Centennial Forest. And she has interest in GIS and remote sensing. So she undertook the large scale, landscape scale approach using different sensors to get an idea of impacts on the forest. And then the work so I worked with her on that from here before leaving. And then when I was present in Morocco, I worked on the field component of this study, looking at stands in detail. So when we think about fire regimes, what we mean by the word regime is the long-term pattern, right? So it's not just one fire event or two fire events, but over a long period of time, what is the frequency, average size, patterns of severity, seasonality, et cetera, that are associated with fires. And fires are affected, or factors that result in fires and then over time lead to fire regimes include ignitions, like shown on the right here in this diagram, atmospheric conditions. So for one particular fire, that's the weather when the fire is burning. But if you look over a long time, that's climate. And then that leads us into the connection between changing climate and fire. And then resources to burn, or fuels, or vegetation, or forests in this case. And all of these factors are affected by people. And of course, they are all affected by climate and the trend in climate towards warming. There are many different tools that researchers use to try to understand fire regimes. And in this work that we did, we were able to make use of a lot of these different tools between the two different scales of these studies. So that was kind of a neat experience to try to be able to combine different methods and work with people with a lot of landscape scale expertise in GIS and remote sensing to try and capture landscape scale changes. Currently, this is sensing of fires using MODIS data. So MODIS satellites are capable of detecting the energy associated with fires as they occur, and by repeated passes over the world, start to accumulate information about fire regimes. This is a really remarkable thing. This is not something that existed before these kinds of satellites were available. We can now spy on, I guess is one way to say it, or measure and quantify the role of fire in ecosystems all around the world. For those of us who have experience in a place with a lot of resources, like the Western US, we're kind of accustomed to fires being accompanied by a very big fire organization, so there's lots of people, there's people flying airplanes with infrared sensors, they're making maps, they're putting it in the GIS, it's showing up on your news feed, and that sort of thing. That doesn't necessarily exist everywhere around the world. In Brazil and the Congo and Indonesia, places where fires play a really important role, it's technology like this that is really for the first time making it possible for people to track and measure what's going on in terms of fire regimes. These data only go back a couple of decades. As we move into the future, hopefully we'll continue to add to it. But it's a great starting point for looking at fire regimes. And it's these kinds of data that Ileana used in putting together her study that led to her master's thesis, working together with her other advisor, Amanda Stan, in the geography department, with Eric Schieffer in geography, and then with several colleagues from the university and the Forest Service in Morocco. And what she did was started with the Hansen data, or what's called the Hansen map. This, as it says there in the top title, high-resolution global maps of forest cover change. Beginning in 2000, Hansen and collaborators, one of whom is Scott Getz, professor here at NAU, have been developing maps that show for the whole world how forest cover is increasing or decreasing. In case you were wondering what the overall answer is, it's decreasing, but there are places where you see increases as well. It's a fantastic data set, again, giving us insight into regions of the world where there may not be inventory plots or it may not be safe to visit in person. But the Hansen data don't interpret the causes of why these changes are happening. Sometimes it's tree cutting, sometimes it's fire, it may be drought, there could be all kinds of causes. The middle study here is work by Andela and others who have taken that MODIS data that we were just looking at, getting that global snapshot of fire activity and turning it into individual fire maps. So using satellites at a somewhat coarse scale, because there's a huge amount of data when you're looking at the whole world, they're making progression maps that show this fire started here, and then they find burning connected to it. And so they make a projection that this is now the new perimeter of the fire. And they do that for the time periods that the fire is burning and the satellites are passing. So this is creating a global fire atlas from MODIS satellite data. And the final category here from this study with the relativized delta normalized burn ratio, which Andy and Jay Miller pioneered. This is using the more technical skills of a GIS analyst. The Global Fire Atlas is something anyone can download. You can just pull it up on your phone and see where fires are burning in Australia if you want to. But carrying out the RDMBR is a more complicated task. It's made increasingly easy by tools and things like Google Earth, but you still have to have a lot of skill and invest time in order to do an appropriate job of doing this. But this provides a way to give a check on the fire data that's coming from MODIS and the interpretations of fire size, and then relate that to the forest change being measured by Hansen. So if you follow the connection between these different satellite approaches, this is what she did. Here's the boundary of Talasanthan National Park, the big map. The red pixels in there are pixels of Hansen forest loss. And then the big white chunky squares are different fires that were picked up by, there were 9 different fire events between 2003, 2018. 17 in this map, but in her thesis, she was able to add 2018 within the park. So you can see that some of the forest loss in this overlapping time period was not associated with a fire event, but underneath those yellow chunky squares, there's a lot more of those red pixels where forests were lost. On the left-hand side, you see an example of the RDMBR calculation where you take a pre-fire image and a post-fire image, and you develop a comparison that allows you to assess the severity of the fire. You can see the pixels standing out in red here in the bottom. So in conclusion of this, with the goal of trying to use these tools to quantify the amount of fires and also detect how much of the overall forest loss is associated with these fires, this is what we found. There was about 2,000 hectares of forest loss. There was basically no forest gain in this area in this time period. Average of 125 hectares a year. The most rare endemic forest lost about 3% in that time period. And we had a strong correlation between fires being picked up by the Global Fire Atlas, which had to be a fairly large fire. It had to be burning pretty hot, putting out a lot of energy in order to be picked up, not a low intensity surface fire. So the summary from this was that severe fires caused about 1/3 of the forest loss over this time period. And there's been a recent estimate of how much forest loss worldwide is associated with fire that comes in pretty close to this number, around 39%. Managers can use this information. One way of using the information has to do with focusing on the fire part. So as we've said, these are primarily human-caused fires. They're caused by activities that can be changed. So people can be more careful with cigarettes. People can potentially not clear forest for cultivation or not use fire to then burn it or not use it in a time when it would spread. I mean, there's opportunities for intervention. Actually carrying out those interventions is super challenging because the role of this cultivation in society has really deep roots and a very strong economic impact. So I don't want to trivialize it and say, oh, you can just, go do these things and then you won't have any more fires. But it at least provides some direction to what kinds of results you might expect if fires could be brought more fully under control, have less severe burning in large fires. However, there's another part of this information. If you look at the flip side, the other thing it's telling us is that two-thirds of the forest loss is not caused by fire. So if managers were to focus only on fire, and let's say they were completely successful, which could never happen, and eliminated fire, well, the majority of the forest loss is happening through other mechanisms, mostly through tree cutting and clearing of lands that is not associated with a severe fire. Also, the Global Fire Atlas was a quite recent publication. It was published in 2019 by Andela and others. And so Ileana's study is, as far as we know, the first to try to compare that to empirical data, in this case from Landsat and from the RDMDR analysis outside of North America. Andela et al. Did a comparison in the US, but now we have an African site where we show a good correlation. Just a quick mention on the sacred grove or marabut that's shown in the inset picture there. I commented earlier when we were kind of discussing this idea of what are the reasons that fires aren't necessarily so big in Morocco. Well, in this part of Morocco, there is a lot of use of the landscape. People are growing crops. They are engaging in pastoralism with a lot of animals that are eating a lot of things, and people make use of wood as well. So there's not always going to be vast areas of forest, especially in low-lying sites. The places, however, that people hold as especially important, in the case of this particular grove, these are trees that have been allowed to grow to maturity because there's a building in the center of this grove where a holy man lived and died and is buried. And so that area around it is respected. And just like with sacred groves in various places around the world, these are little islands of biodiversity and little islands where trees in this case might be able to reach their full size and maturity that they cannot do in other places on the landscape. Okay, so that was kind of this big picture landscape look at fire. But the tools that we're applying there have a kind of a threshold of burning before they can become active, before MODIS will detect something and call it a fire. It has to be a certain size and be emitting a certain amount of energy. So we here in Arizona know pretty well that low intensity fires also play an important ecological role. And by using tree ring measurements, we can determine elements of that role. We can determine the dates and positions, map positions of fire events in the past. And then we can relate those to different kinds of ecological outcomes. We can look at the mortality or survival of trees, of different species. We can draw inferences about the role of low intensity fires in also keeping fuel levels low and thereby reducing the likelihood of severe burning and so on. So the field measurements here were oriented in that direction. I was able to install 3 field sites. They're in the highest elevations not the absolute highest. The absolute highest elevations of the park are dominated by this species, Cedrus atlantica. And that at its highest, this is a fairly low one. At its highest elevation, it's individual trees with rock in between them. Some of those trees are extremely old, and they have contributed to long tree ring chronologies that some of our colleagues at the University of Arizona and other colleagues in Morocco and Spain have used to develop long 600-year-long reconstructions of Mediterranean climate. So these trees have a great beauty, they have a biological value and an important scientific value. We were working in the areas right below that, which is the mixed conifer forest that has the Abies species here, Abies marocana, Moroccan fir, and Pinus nigra. The Moroccan fir, for people who have worked in the Mediterranean, is closely related to Abies pinsapo, a species found in Spain. And Pinus nigra is a very widely distributed species that for some reason has the common name Austrian pine, a little bit like Scots pine, which, yes, there's some of them in Scotland, but that's kind of the extreme corner of its range. But this is a subspecies of Pinus nigra that is also endemic to North Africa. So even when we're not necessarily dealing with a completely different species, we do have genetic diversity that is not well understood and that would be useful to conserve. This picture of Pinus nigra may also look familiar to folks from here because it looks a lot like a ponderosa pine forest. Here's a little scene to give some flavor of getting out into that environment. This is in the wintertime, so you can see a little bit of rain on the windshield. You can kind of see some of those fir trees. Relatively sparse understory, but you can see that there's a lot of shrubby understory, and many of the Mediterranean shrub species are very well adapted to fire and very flammable. This is El Mehdi Jadar, who worked with me in the field. We collected data on fixed area plots. We took data on all the factors that are listed there. Here is our wood shop back at the university. And we installed our tools out on the patio in this area, kind of in the back of the building, and found that to be a good place to carry out sanding in this case, mounting of samples. These are scanned tree ring samples. I think they're really beautiful when they're all put together like that. Apart from the kind of aesthetic appreciation, another thing you can notice is that some of them are growing really fast. So there's some examples that have very wide spaces between the rings. Others are much, much tighter. Those differences have something to do with competition. They also have something to do with what species is involved. The pines on here with the biggest rings are Pinus pinaster, a very fast growing species. And then in addition to this data on forest structure and forest age, and as well as dynamics that we can later interpret from those measurements of tree rings, we also wanted to use tree rings to look at past fire events. So this can be done by looking at fire scarred trees. This type of study has been most widely done in North America. There are many other places in the world where these kinds of techniques can be applied. And some of the kind of work that we're doing in the Mediterranean is starting to contribute to a small but growing network that eventually might come close to this North American network. However, the North American network is going nuts because this is from a paper that's 10 years old, and now there's something like 4 times as many sites. And some colleagues are working on a new publication that's going to blow this map away with a lot more points on it. So here are a couple of fire-scarred Pinus nigra trees. You can see that the fires have burned in there. They've wounded the trees, but not killed them. And so when we have fires that damage the tree, they leave a scar that's visible between the rings of the tree. And one can collect samples from down trees, from stumps, or from standing live or dead trees. In the case of standing trees, it does not mean felling the tree or leaving it in a weakened state, it means taking a very small sample relative to the size of the tree that leaves the tree strong and intact. And these trees, pines, also defend themselves against fungus or insect attack by pitching resin into the wounded areas. That's what they do when they're burned, or when a branch is broken, or a logging cable cuts into the tree. That's also what happens with a fire scar sample. So here's the first one that we oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It goes into about the depth of the got a couple of thousand views, and I've never had that before. He walks up behind me, I didn't know he was there, and he goes down and walked away and to the other side. To the size of the tree, this is a very small amount of wood that's being removed from the cross section. So what are we looking for in these samples? What's really common when we start talking with people about an interest in working in their forest and sampling these kinds of trees is they might show us some big blackened tree that's all burnt all over and it's all black and charred and obviously has been through fires, and go, we should sample this tree. But the thing that we need to find is trees that were wounded while they still survive, so that they can start to grow back and heal over that wound. Here comes another wound to healing, another wound to healing, and so on. So we're looking for all of the factors that are shown here at the top of this slide. We have to see that cells were killed, but other cells survived and came back afterwards. And my friend and colleague Angie Moline has made this really neat video. Explains the process of this sample, what happens next. Turns into a fire issue. Can't touch I think that's a really effective means of communication for reaching out to a lot of people. So now you know what this chart looks like. This is what the chart is. This is the preliminary data anyway from these 3 sites. So they're all stacked up together. The horizontal lines are individual samples. All these little vertical bars are fires. And our oldest tree goes back about 270 years, oldest fire about 200 years. And then where we can have enough depth of data to start analysis about from 1879. Here in the Southwest, that was a date when a lot of fire began to be shut off. You can see in this Moroccan forest, plenty of fires have occurred. They're accumulated on the lower axis here, and there's a period of many fires, a mid-century period of few fires, a period to the end of the 20th century with a lot of fires. That corresponds with the data on the increased cannabis cultivation. And then a recent period with less that might be the national park management. So what we're going to do with this is compare it to tree data. On the right-hand side here, we have data on density of trees and basal area. This cross-hatched one, that's this huge bar right here, are very dense oaks, Quercus rotundifolia, or for people working in the Mediterranean, that's a species closely related to Quercus ilex. And there's lots and lots of them, but you see their basal area doesn't amount to that much. That means there's a lot of really skinny little trees. In terms of age, our oldest Pinus Nigra tree was over 300 years old. We can go back about 200 years for the oldest fir and Pinus pinaster. These are not extraordinary ages in terms of like the records for these species or anything, but for an area that has been intensively utilized by people for many hundreds of years, this is a good indicator of conservation of some old trees. And then what we're going to be doing is trying to draw connections between the fire regime, the fire dates, and the mapped locations of fires, and some of the elements of forest structure and dynamics, such as changes that we can measure in the tree rings. But I haven't done that yet, so that's kind of where we're headed. If you look down at site 3, this was the one that had all those oaks. It was super high density. It is really challenging just to move through this forest. And it's because of a tremendous response of these sprouting species after a period of a couple of severe fires in the 1980s. Okay, so as we're moving towards the end, we're incorporating perspectives of managers and scientists from the organizations that I mentioned. My colleague Lassen Taiki was my host from the university, and a person who is a landscape ecologist, has looked at changes in this region for decades and was invaluable in terms of being able to do the logistics of getting permission, of getting supplies, of finding help, being able to get out in the field, and all the more so during the pandemic, which made it hard. So in terms of a sabbatical experience, being able to work with colleagues who support your mission is really important. In the lower picture, we're meeting with GIS experts from the forestry department, talking about vegetation and fire maps. Here's the director of Talasanthan National Park. She came out to see us twice in the field. She's coring 150-year-old Pinus pinaster right here. And then our next steps, we want to turn these data sets into publications, the work that Ileana Castro led, and the field study that I was working on whilst there. We want to look for opportunities to expand on this network, to look at other places in the Mediterranean region, and outreach. So the Fulbright program, which supported my stay in Morocco, was very helpful in providing opportunities for contacts and outreach. And so through these organizations, I was able to do some in-person presentations, a couple of podcasts that are listed here. We did a workshop on dendrochronology in French. And based on, after that workshop, found some opportunities for adding dendrochronological work for a couple of master's projects. So this is Marwan Zemrani, And he's looking at a species here called Thuya or Tetraclinus articulata in the Cupressaceae, kind of related to junipers. To anyone who has looked at tree rings of junipers, you know that means that the tree rings are not going to be an easy thing to look at. It's a widespread tree in North Africa, very drought resistant. The wood makes these beautiful, can be used to make these beautiful artisanal objects, very valuable, but hasn't really been studied in terms of its age, its growth, its dynamics, because the wood is hard to work with. So he is starting a project on that. And then a second project on dendrogeomorphology, really. The picture in the upper left is showing it all. That big rock came down the hillside and hit that tree and stopped there and left a wound on the tree. So not just fires that scar trees, all kinds of things can cause scars, and those scars can be dated. This is a steep hillside next to Tetuan, which is a just beautiful city sitting in a valley. And Ali here is coring the unscarred side of the tree. If you look at these two cores side by side, one that intercepts the edge of the scar has this little wound in it, and the other one is intact. So by matching ring patterns before and after the wound, we can date the rock fall. What geologists do then, if they know dates at which rockfall events occurred, they can start to put together a risk map. It's like a probability map for rockfall events. Right down below us, there are houses, and some of those houses have big boulders sitting next to them. Some final words about the Fulbright program. Tremendous opportunity that many of us in this room and many of us at NAU have capitalized on. I wanted to particularly mention that I think professors are very familiar with the Fulbright program, but a lot of students are not. And it's an opportunity to go abroad to present your ideas. The students in the Moroccan program right now, many of them were in an intermediate stage between finishing their bachelor's and starting their master's, and were granted a 5 or 6 month opportunity to go to Morocco and put those ideas into place. And of course, the Fulbright program works in both directions, bringing people here. And just a little mosaic of people and places and animals that made this an enjoyable and enriching experience. Morocco has a lot of cats, and the cats are what maybe we would call feral. They're not living in people's houses, but people do take care of them. And so there's cats all over the place, and that's really nice. We'll stop for questions. This image shows that Arizona is everywhere. And the chainsaw that I pointed out to you is called the Arizona 55. It's built by a Spanish company. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pete. That presentation was on fire. We sure missed you when you were gone in the lab, but it's good to see what you got up to, and thanks for sharing it with us. For the sake of the people on Zoom, I'm going to take questions with the microphone. If you are uncomfortable using the microphone, please just speak loud enough that we can try to get you on the system. Otherwise, I'll head over to you with the mic. Any questions? Yeah.
I'm curious why you chose Morocco as a spot to travel to.
On my previous sabbatical, I was in the Mediterranean as well. I've had 3 sabbaticals, and they've all been in the Mediterranean. And I had a chance to visit Morocco for the first time and got to visit this national park. I'm going to stand here so this microphone can pick it up for Zoom, I hope. Yeah. And I was struck by some of those similarities and differences to Western and Southwestern forests. And I find that to be a really remarkable thing, where we can look at situations that in many ways are similar and many other important ways are different, and try to learn more about them and make good comparisons. And Morocco is a really beautiful country. So the question was about considering traditional use of fire in this project. And that's a complicated question. So there's lots of reasons why the answer is no. One is that there was a pandemic. Another is that I'm a foreigner and have a language and cultural barrier that makes it more complicated than it would be for a Moroccan researcher. And I'm not a social scientist or a person who has a good background. I would love to work with such people to try to think about those kinds of issues. And then a final barrier that is true in Morocco and is true in a lot of other places that I have been around the world is that a lot of managers are quite anti-fire and also don't think that many fires occurred in the past. And a lot of people were very surprised that really that tree shows that there were 5 fires there, because I don't think there were any fires there. Part of that is because they're thinking of a fire as necessarily being a big lethal event. And part of it, I think, is the cultural tradition of all the reasons why when we try to think about saving forests, traditionally, we've often thought about putting fires out. So all those things are elements that we can and should work on and that I would like to work on. It's a good question. We'll ask the same question. So, however, Will has a second part. Has TEK been consistently applied? And I don't think that we clearly know enough in this case. In this case, what we found is that we did see that there was plenty of fire for the last 140, 150 years in these forests. Lots of surface fires going on. Some of the recent ones might be associated with cannabis cultivation. The older ones almost certainly are not. So there's plenty of fire going on. And we've seen similar information in Greece and in Spain, where some similar studies have been carried out. But it has been challenging to try to get information about the reasons that might be behind those fires, because for the most part, they're considered illegal or a bad thing to do. Nobody's going to want to necessarily talk about it. There's a recent film that some of you may have seen the announcement for. It's called Inhabitants. It was produced by Colleen Cooley here at NAU. And it's in like a partial release right now. And Native American speaker from California is talking about how people in the tribe used fire, but they were always told that that's bad, it's wrong, it's illegal, you're going to go to jail for the traditional use. And I think there's factors like that still going on around the world.
I think, yeah, we've got time.
Thanks. Pete, I'm curious just what's known about recent climate change in that region. I mean, has it warmed unusually or gotten particularly wetter or drier?
So that is a great question. And I wish I had a great answer for it. We are engaged in trying to get access to detailed climate records, and the climate records do not go back very far. And so right now, the records that we have access to, this is a complicated thing because there's these different governmental agencies involved with the climate stations. So I don't know. We're trying to work on that right now.
So I think we're going to wrap it up there. Please feel free to join the discussion for the next hour in room 34A. And if we could just give Pete another round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. And if anyone in the Zoom chat wants to join that discussion, you can just log off the Zoom and join the other one on the website. Did you get any other questions?
I don't know. It was a little more than I could handle to try to give a talk and to do the talk at the same time. Angela Trujillo is she's the Forest Service International Programs representative for Morocco.
Oh, cool.
Right. So I'm gonna go ahead and move on.